It was in the year 2000 that the show Malcolm in the Middle dropped. And it ran for 7 years, from 2000 to 2006. And if you never saw the show, I'm not recommending it, I'm just commenting on it. But the show is essentially about a highly dysfunctional family. Now, I know that none of you here could probably relate to that, right? Now, I know one of the things that made the show so appealing to the masses is that as you're watching this highly dysfunctional family, you're kind of connecting it to your own family experience, and I think that's what made the sitcom so funny. And in fact, I'm going to show you a clip that would demonstrate the dysfunction of the family. This group has gathered together to take family photos, and then you get to see how the dysfunction works.
Squeeze in, a little closer together, chins up like baby birds. Lovely.
Lou, shut up. Stop touching me. I'm not touching you. I was clipping on my tie. Lyle, you were touching me.
Stop it.
Why do we have to do this?
Because we don't have a single picture of us all together. That's ridiculous. We're a family. We should have a family portrait.
Well, Francis isn't here.
Well, I'm not going to cough up $200 to fly him in for one silly picture. Where's Dewey? Dewey, get out of there. That's not your family.
You sure you want autumn leaves as a backdrop?
Yes.
Didn't even look at Happy Windmills. It's more colorful. Space shuttle.
Next.
Come on, let's go.
I have a coupon here for one 8x10 and 2 wallet size for $9.99, and that's what I want. I don't want the Golden Moments collection. I don't want the Family and Friends collection. I don't want the Lifetime of Love. I want one 8x10 and 2 wallet size for $9.99.
Fine. We have an installment plan if that would help.
I brought a picture of Francis. He's gonna be in the portrait. Cool. I'll hold it. No, I'm gonna hold it. Let go. Come on. I'm gonna hold it. Let go.
Dewey, pants on, mister.
I'm sorry, but this coupon's expired.
What?
It's expired. What you want will run you $39.50.
Ooh, Lonely Beach. We're kind of the Lonely Beach family, right?
Hell.
But for another $5, you can have the instant memory set. That comes with double exposure silhouettes for the grandparents.
Could you please just do what I'm asking you to?
I'm older. It was my idea.
That is it! Get up! Get back! Come here! Go there! Okay, we are going to take this picture and it is going to be good. And that means no faces, no tongues, no crossed eyes, no bunny ears. We are going to smile. We are going to look good. It is going to cost us $9.99, and all of this is going to happen by the time I count to 3.
Was it like a picture of a-
3.
Now, maybe some of you can relate to that. The reason why we're talking about dysfunctional families today is that in our text, Genesis 25, we're going to be looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly of family life. We're going to be examining a dysfunctional family. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis 25. We began our adventure in the book of Genesis some time ago, and we made it through the primordial beginnings to the creation, the fall, the flood, and the dispersion after the Tower of Babel. And if you are interested in hearing about these curious things from Genesis, that is the creation, evolution, and science, and the Nephilim, it's all available on hilltopsonora.com's teaching tab. Now, when we last looked at Genesis, we concluded the adventures of Abraham. And before we pass the torch to Isaac and Jacob, it might be helpful to give a bare bones review of the basics of Genesis. Remember that Genesis is not a book. It is the first part of a single book that Jesus called the Book of Moses. We call it the Pentateuch. Now, it's also the first five books of the Bible, but remember, it was one book, and we think Genesis was separated because that's how many scrolls. We think there were 5 scrolls, and Genesis was the first scroll. Moses was the editor, historian, and writer of the book of Moses, and he wasn't around during the events of Genesis, but he preserved an existing oral and written history. And it was in the 420s BC that Moses was near the end of his life, and he was camped at a place called Kadesh Barnea, and they were waiting to go into the promised land. And it was there that he completed this work, and then after he passed away, it was later edited by Joshua and probably some of the other scribes in the community. We might ask the question, what is the book of Genesis about? Well, if I could describe it in one sentence, it would be this. It's about God's plan to bless his rebellious people, which ultimately points forward to the Sinai covenant. Now, before we get into our story, I want to just look at some of the literary structure of what's happening. Now remember, Genesis is the Word of God, but it's also literature. We can have both at the same time. And we must remember that there are presence of something called toledots. This is a Hebrew word. Toledot is translated generations or descendants, and they are key structural elements within the book of Genesis. And here are two examples of toledots. You can see it says, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth. And in chapter 25, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. The word toledot, generation, it appears 11 times in this way, and it functions as a marker to divide the book into distinct sections that highlight genealogical and historical progression. We call such things chapters, but in Hebrew, it's the toledots. And so we could divide the book of Moses, or rather the first scroll in the book of Moses, like this. You can see that there are multiple toledots, and if we were to remove the chapters and verses that we created, this would actually be the structure of the book. These would be the chapters. And so our first verse for today introduces a new toledot, which we would describe as the Jacob cycle, which begins in chapter 25, verse 19. And even though the toledot begins talking about Isaac, Abraham's son, it's ultimately about Jacob, who is the protagonist. And it begins with Isaac praying for his son, Jacob. So this particular chapter, or toledot, is going to carry us from chapter 25 to 35. So be prepared to spend some time on the adventures and misadventures of Jacob. So here we are, Genesis 25, I'm going to read 19 to 34. This is from the ESV. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." And when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, and all his body was like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. And afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in the tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." And therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." And Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me now." And so he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. And thus Esau despised his birthright. The author begins the chapter with some basic genealogy, and he reminds us of the lineage from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and Rebekah, and the origin of both of their parents. And remember that in Genesis, there's a considerable amount of time talking about genealogy because lineage was important to ancient peoples, and history is important. And the names and the places and the details also confirm the historical accuracy of the account. And the lineage provides the basic structural understanding for the rest of the Bible. Now, after giving us a very brief introduction, our story begins in verse 21 with a praying father. He tells us that Isaac prayed to God on behalf of his wife. What was his prayer request? To have a child. Now, our culture generally doesn't value children. Like many Western nations, our country has a sub-replacement fertility rate. But in a rural culture, you need children to run the farm as they grow older, and an older earth needed people. And so having children was a cultural thing. Everyone assumed that you would do it, but it was also commanded, since the Lord promised Isaac's dad, Abraham, that he would become a great nation. And so Isaac conceiving and praying for a child was part of God's plan, and so he prayed. Verse 21 tells us that the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah, though she was barren, conceived. Now, after progressing in her pregnancy, she discovered that she had twins. Now, as a guy, I'm wondering, how do you know if you have twins? But as a woman who's carried, maybe you know what that's like. But I will say that there is a surviving medical manual from the 2nd century AD written by Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Greek physician. And in his work, he describes how midwives and physicians could discern the presence of twins through abdominal palpitations and other techniques. So don't think of these as primitive barbarians. They knew how to discern the presence of twins. But not only did Rebekah discover that she was carrying twins, she also noticed that they were particularly rambunctious. Because she says in verse 22, the children struggled within her. And so this led to an inquiry of the Lord. Now remember, we don't know exactly how they inquired of the Lord in the patriarchal days, but however it was done, she received an answer in verse 23 in the form of a prophecy. The Lord told her, there are 2 nations in your womb, and they will be divided. One will be stronger, and the older will serve the younger. And since God's plan was building a great nation, he was already guiding the process and therefore prophesied as much. Now, in verse 24, Rebekah gives birth, and the narrator gives an odd description of the firstborn. He came out red and hairy. In fact, it's described that his body was like a hairy cloak. And so they named him Esau, which means hairy. What's the explanation for this little guy's appearance? Well, there are layers to this. Certainly, we take this as an historical narrative and we believe it to be true, but there are also literary things to consider, like foreshadowing. Esau was later named Red, and his descendants would hail from an area called Seir, which also is a derivative of the word hairy. So though Esau was born a hairy red kid, the narrator is connecting him to both the Edomites, translated as red, and their dwelling place, the mountain of Seir, which is translated as hairy. So it's kind of an interesting coincidence that the nation he would produce would be called Red, and they would be from a mountain called Hairy, and then here's this kid born red and hairy. Oddly enough, and I'm not going to spend any time contemplating how often this occurs or whether it does occur, but when Esau was born, his brother's arm was protruding from the womb, holding fast upon Esau's heel. And he was therefore named Jacob, which means cheater or deceiver. The narrator wastes no time because in verse 27, the boys are already grown up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was something of an introvert who stayed among the tents. In that world, we might say a blue-collar and a white-collar relationship here. The narrator also gives us a bit of info that will come into the story later. Verse 28, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, this sets up the main event of our story, which has to do with the despised birthright. One day, Jacob was cooking a lentil stew. Now, whatever the specifics of the ingredients, the stew was colored red. Now, if you've ever cooked red lentils before, you know that once they're cooked, they lose their red color. So you couldn't have a red stew with red lentils. And so what we think is that there were local berries or perhaps sumac, and that made the stew red. Now, over the centuries, there have been many attempts to recreate the stew that Jacob made. And in fact, there are recipe websites that use sumac and lentils to try to recreate this stew. And I found one, and it looks like this. In fact, my family's going to be eating it this week in honor of this passage. It's lentils with sumac. So it happened that Esau came in from his hunt, and the text describes him as exhausted. Now, it never actually says he was starving, but he himself in verse 32 said, I'm about to die. He was hangry, as they call it. He comes in after what was likely many days of hunting, and he's exhausted and very hungry, and he says to his younger brother, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. And then we know that Jacob also had bread. So the narrator gives us a side note. Later, because of the red stew incident, Esau acquired the nickname Red. So his name was Harry, but then they called him Red because of his color and the stew. This incident became notorious. He would become later the father of the Edomites. That's the word for red. Now, I want you to notice the progression in the negotiation here and how quickly this escalated. Step 1, let me have some of that red stew. Step 2, sell me your birthright. Really? This interchange seems a bit odd. So what's happening here? Well, was Esau just being dramatic about his hunger, or was he really starving? Well, remember, we don't live in a fasting culture. We eat multiple times a day, and it's been noted in primitive cultures that hunt, that people will go often days without eating. They will be out in the wilderness for days and not have any food, and that was normal in the ancient world. And so it would not be unheard of for a man like Esau to be out in the wilderness for several days and return having not eaten for 72 hours. He may have been really, really hungry. Still, I'm thinking, you couldn't find anyone else to give you food? You have a mother, you have a father, you have friends, like no one is willing. I mean, you bring food to your father, which he loves, like no one has any food? I don't know. He may have been ravenous, but he still engaged in a foolish trade. And so he had an empty stomach, he was running on ketones, he smelled the delicious stew, and then he gave up his birthright. So he traded the immediate pleasure of food for the birthright that would have brought him honor and wealth. In fact, in verse 34, the narrator tells us Esau despised his birthright. Well, what was Jacob's motive? Couldn't he just have said, yeah, here's some stew? No, because they're siblings and they fight all the time. That's what happens. We already know his name means cheater or deceiver. And he was the second born. He didn't have the birthright. He saw his opportunity, and then he made his move. Now, what is the big deal about a birthright? Well, typically, when a man died, his estate was divided among his sons. And the firstborn not only had a position of honor, but he would receive a double portion of the estate. So in our context, if a man died and he had $1 million, and he had 4 sons, we would say, well, each son gets $250. But in this world, since the firstborn got a double, 3 sons would get $200,000, and then the firstborn would get $400,000. But on top of that, the birthright of the firstborn was a position of honor. You were positioned as the leader of the family, and sometimes even viewed as the spiritual leader. And so this is why the writer of Hebrews made such a strong comment about Esau's decision. He says, see that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. The poor guy, 4,000 years later, still getting harassed for this decision. It was an unholy abdication of honor, wealth, and responsibility. And so that's the story, but it might help us to consider just a few literary implications, a few big pictures. Now remember, this is simultaneously the Word of God and a piece of literature, and we can therefore see certain patterns at work. Number one is that what we see is the Lord is continuing the establishment of His great nation. So if we step back and we look at the picture, the Lord is trying, not trying, but He is establishing a nation. But the story also sets up the deceit, the favoritism, and the general dysfunction of the family, which will lead us all the way to the time of Joseph. The story also explains the presence of the nation of Edom, which will appear later in the Bible. In fact, the nation of Edom, that is the children and descendants of Esau, will be named 25 times from Genesis to Malachi. So this is the story. We get the literary movements, but what does this mean for us? And how do we apply any of this? Well, let's look at the good and the bad and the ugly of family life. First, we read that Jacob had a praying dad. There are multiple layers to this. First, we find that Isaac prayed for his wife. And we could just stop right there and say, men, are you praying for your wife? Something to think about. The Bible is filled with stories, and we're supposed to take the virtuous things and emulate them. He is lauded as being one of the patriarchs. What did he do? He prayed for his wife. And so, something to think about. He also, in that prayer, prayed for his son. So, something to think about, dads. Are you praying for your wives? Not that you have multiple wives, but dads collectively. Are you praying for your wives? And are you praying for your children? Now, I know this might be unpopular, but here's what Paul says. He says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the wife is her husband. And so, men, we are supposed to be the covering for our wives, and the application is quite simple, that we're to regularly and faithfully pray for our wives. We're to be praying for them. Now, there's another layer to this. Isaac just wasn't praying for his wife, he was praying for the Lord's will. How? Because it was the Lord's plan to create a nation from Abraham's line, and this required children, and so she was barren, and he was praying for her to conceive, and in fact, by doing so, he was praying for the Lord's will. And so men, like praying for our wives, we should regularly and faithfully pray for the Lord's will in our lives. Now remember, Jesus even told us, these are the direct words of the Lord himself, here's how I want you to pray. He says, our Father in heaven, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, this isn't a general thing. Lord, we pray that on the entire earth your will would... No, this is for you. I'm praying, Lord, that as far as I can control it, within my life and my family, that your will would be done. So we see that Isaac is a praying man, and men, we ought to add this to our repertoire or be encouraged to do so. But we also find another thing, and now we'll lift up the women, that Jacob had a mom who sought the Lord. When confronted with her pregnancy, twins, and their rambunctious pre-birth behavior, she sought the Lord. And in fact, I would imagine sometimes the trials of raising children have brought many women to seek the Lord for guidance. And I want you to look at her exact quote in verse 22, and many of you mothers out there have felt this. She says, "Why is this happening to me?" You may have felt that way at times with your children. Why is this happening to me? All this to say, this is a virtue, once again, worth emulating. And so, ladies, seek the Lord in all that you do. I know this is very vague, and so we can spend some time on this, but really, this is for you to contemplate. In what areas of your life do you need to seek the Lord? Now, the final good thing is that the sons had birthrights. And we can't spend much time on this, but the Bible instructs us to leave something to our children and to our grandchildren to build generational wealth. And this isn't always in our control, but it requires a lot of wisdom. Nonetheless, the command remains, if we consider Proverbs 13, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So this is the good thing about the family. The dad was a praying dad. The mom was a mom who sought the Lord, and they were concerned about the heritage of their children. And yet, we need to move on to the bad. The parents showed favoritism. If we look at the blatant statement in verse 28, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, I know parenting is difficult, and it's natural that we will get along with one child over the other. It could be that one child has a similar hobby, and so you naturally spend time together. And it's also natural that one child and one parent might have a natural personality friction, and that's normal as well. But all this to say that as parents, we must do our very best not to show favoritism. We must be impartial, just judges, guides, and providers. And look at what both James and Jude say about this. But if you show favoritism, you commit sin. As the story unfolds, We're going to see how the sin of favoritism rips this family apart. Now, there was another thing that we see. Clearly, there was an immoral sibling rivalry. These were fraternal combatants from the very beginning. And I would remind all of the children in the room that the conflicts that you have with each other are normal and common, but when I say normal, I don't mean okay. Children, you must make an effort to be kind and reasonable and get along with your siblings, because what you're creating is a mold in your relationship that will affect you for the rest of your life. Because as of right now, sitting in this room, some of you remember mean things that your brother or sister did to you, and you still carry that with you decades later. And so I would challenge the children that you must be kind and reasonable and get along with your siblings as well as you can. Now, we've gone from the good, the bad. What about the ugly? Well, we find that there is outright manipulation. Jacob lived up to his name. It means cheater or deceiver. And he cheated and manipulated his brother out of his birthright. What he did was legal, but it was immoral. And there's not much to say here other than that there are things that we can do that are allowed or technically legal, but they are morally wrong. And Paul warns us against such divisive people. He says, for such persons do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites. By smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the minds of naive people. Now, here's the final vice to consider, and this is probably the prime lesson for this narrative, is that Esau traded long-term benefits for immediate pleasure. The story ends with a comment on Esau's actions. Thus, he despised his birthright. He gave up a position of honor and wealth and influence, all to satisfy a biological urge. And as was read earlier in Philippians, his God was his stomach. Now, if we're talking about the context of families, how does succumbing to immediate food cravings pilfer long-term benefits? And I will give you just two areas. Number one, money. You see, ask anyone on planet Earth, and they're broke. Everyone doesn't have enough money. Everyone needs more money. But ask the majority of the people what they do, and they make decisions about money based upon their stomach. And when I say decisions, I mean foolish decisions. Now, I'm not going to pick on you for buying a Starbucks or a cup of coffee or going out to eat or anything like that. But what I am saying is that you can't say, I'm broke, and then yet be blowing all of your money on food that is prepared for you. And all we have to do is some simple math. Let's just say that you get a drink here and a coffee there and lunch. $20 a day is easy to spend. But with today's culture, now you're talking about 30. You go out to lunch, you grab a drink somewhere, you're up to $30. It's not a big deal. I work hard. It's only $30. But you multiply that by 250. What's 250? The average days that a person works. And so you multiply that every time you go to work by 250, now you're dropping $5,000 to $8,000 a year. Why? Because of the cravings of food. And I get it. You work hard, you're tired, and there someone is offering warm food, hot food, caffeinated stuff. It makes you feel great. It's who doesn't want to get it? And yet we're trading our long-term wealth for this biological craving. But of course, the other issue on this one is health. And that is it's laced with empty calories, and everything is, got too much sugar, too much salt, highly processed food, and all that to say, once again, we have a biological urge. There it is. We see it, we smell it, we taste it, and then we're trading long-term health for garbage food. Now, I'm not trying to be mean here. There is a reasonable time to go out to eat, and if you have the money, do it. But what I'm saying is if you look at the majority of Americans and their financial problems, you will almost always find food at the center of that problem. And if you look at the health of the average American, you will almost always find food at the center of that problem. So this is something to consider. Here's a guy that had wealth, honor, position, and he saw the food, he smelled it, he looked at it, it was delicious, and he gave it all up for that one instant of pleasure. Once again, Paul warns us that these type of people, their stomach is their God. Now, you might say, okay, all right, we've had enough of that. Is there any good news here? The good news is that what we're going to see, the Lord is going to take this dysfunctional family and he's going to use them to the furtherment of his kingdom. How? Because he's going to train, just like he trained Abraham and Isaac, he's going to train Jacob to trust him and to rely on him, and he's going to mature and to grow him in his faith in the Lord. And the good news is that you and I, whatever family that we're in, whether we're in and out of a family, whether our family was reasonably healthy or dysfunctional, that we have a God who oversees our lives, and if we will place our faith in him and trust him, then he will guide us, he will mature us, and he will grow us, and he will use us for his glory. But that only happens when we call upon him in faith, when we abandon ourselves and say, Lord, I'm done doing things my way. I'm just like Esau. I'll give it all up. But when we mature and grow, which really means that we place our faith in the Lord, then we can be saved and he will use us, and we'll see him actually change the nature of families. So the good news here is that the Lord is sovereign. He takes dysfunctional families and he uses them for his glory. That sounds pretty good. I've heard word that they're making a remake, a continuation of the show Malcolm in the Middle. And there's like a reunion show coming. And so it's interesting to think, are they going to mature, or are they going to be still the same family that yells at each other? But see, unlike the TV shows, if the Lord gets a hold of your family, he's going to work those things out.